kind of like this overall week, 0-3. So I kind of wanted to get just like your overall thoughts um, with this week. Like, what did you see out there? Is there something that a particular game that you want to talk about, or just kind of give me like your 30,000 foot view of this week so far?
I thought they controlled the momentum of the first game great until that fourth quarter. And that's kind of been the theme of things is they can't seem to close. Even last night against Boston, they came back to a point where they had the lead at one point. And granted, like Boston is the best, and I take literally no reservation saying this. They are the best team in the NBA, right? They're the champion for a reason. Some people want to discredit them. Some people want to say that like they're not a they kind of compare them to like the bubble Lakers. It seems like with the discourse of like how they get discussed. But I think that's the best team in the NBA. Yes, right. And like you had a lead on them. At the end of the day, we want to talk about moral victories and things that we can take from these games. It's great. The progression compared to last year in terms of competitiveness is obviously prevalent. These are good teams they're playing. Cleveland, Indiana, Boston. Boston just won the championship. Indiana was in the conference finals. Cleveland was in the second round of the playoffs. Like these are all really, really good teams that have only gotten better. And the Pistons are in dogfights with them, right? But I think it's just discouraging to me and to try and tell you as a Pistons fan out there that, hey, I know they're losing right now and I know they haven't won a game yet this season, but there's things to be hopeful for, right? Like I can tell you that like Cade looks like he has taken a step, right? Like it looks like he is just dominating out there, like more than any other year in his career thus far. One thing I've been really impressed by him is he's headhunting on posters. This is something he's never done in his career at any point. I remember people were calling like the Luka comparisons were because he was unathletic, and I've seen him do like 3 posters in each game thus far. It's just, and he was headhunting Derek White heavy yesterday. Like he had 2 or 3 attempted ones before he landed one. So it's been interesting. I can't tell you that like, oh, this team is, really turning a corner until they start winning games, right? Like I want to say that, but I'm gonna sound like a broken record. There's been so many times we've had that type of discussion that it's almost tiring for me to be like, hey, yeah, like, there's things to take away from this. Cause at this point, and that was kind of the point of the article I had written last week, is the time for moral victories is kind of past, right? Like, we can say, oh, it was a good game, good fight, and they're still a young team, but you're only a young team for so long, and you can only get away with these things for so long, especially this year when they're trying to put a competitive product on the floor.
Yeah, I thought like each game, like the Pacers game, I thought they played for 42 minutes. That was probably the best basketball I've seen. Dare I say, like from the Casey's like second year, if you want to call it, like them just competing hard, never really being out of the game. The game was always within reach. But to your point that you had mentioned, like I think the closing thing or having a closer to say is still a question mark on this team. Like I think it should be Cade personally, and we'll get into rotations a little bit later. Um, but yeah, I think some of these games, like the Boston game, if they had a closer, I mean, they were up 6. No one scored for 5 minutes. I mean, you pad that lead. Maybe you do beat Boston if you do have a closer. But I think overall, I really like what I've seen out of them in terms of just like competing, not giving up. Because if this was last year's team, fully guaranteed 20, 30-point losses, in my opinion, anyways.
I think that's like something last year where we talked about leadership, right? Like that's something that this team has really been lacking. And you could tell last year when, other teams would go on a run, if the game was competitive, like the minute other teams went on a run, heads would start hanging, mistakes start happening a lot more frequently. That's happening less now, but that's still not to say that it's not happening at all, right? Like it takes time to break bad habits, and you can tell like the turnovers obviously are still an issue, especially when other teams start going on runs. Like that Indiana game is a perfect example, where Detroit had complete momentum of the game, but the minute it started shifting, you could tell the guys were like, "Oh God," you know what I mean? Like, "Oh, here we go again." And it's unfortunate like that they don't have that, because obviously it's human nature, right? To be like, "Oh, um, upset about going down in the game. But like you can, when you start being able to see it as a spectator, that's when you know like it's more of a confidence issue versus just like a oh shit, like we're going down now issue. And I want to see that improve. I really would like to see that improve. Like the turnovers and then like it's like turning the ball over and then you can tell they're kicking themselves for turning it over before getting back on defense. Like you just need to get back on defense when you turn it over. It's just been a lot of like young team mistakes I've seen thus far, and like they're young and they've been young for some time, and like that's why I say like it's hard to just be like, you know, hey, there's things to take away and they're growing because these are the same mistakes they've been making. But the games have been competitive, and I think that's really like been encouraging. I think there's some players that need to step up, looking like at a Tobias Harris thus far. I think he's someone who, if they want to start winning these games, has to really start hitting his shots. And also, I think last night, especially, wasn't taking the best shot selection. I think the Indiana game, like it was just a thing of shots not falling, right? But you look at last night's game, and it's like I think sometimes it was too ISO heavy on his half, where the ball was kind of stopping the minute he touched it, and that just can't be happening. Same with Tim Hardaway. It's going to take a second, I think, for these guys to kind of like mesh on the court. But I do have confidence that they will, because these are vets that seem to be serious about, you know, team building and, you know, finding a way to help the young guys rather than just kind of every man for himself type of thing that it's been the last couple of years. So it's just going to be a thing of figuring it out, I think.
Yeah, I think when you kind of look at the games overall, those were 3 winnable games. I don't think they were going to win the Cleveland game, and we'll get into turnovers a little bit later in the podcast because it still seems like it's an issue. But I thought, you know, the first 3 games, those are all teams that made the playoffs last year, and one of those teams won the NBA championship, in the Boston Celtics. I think it's a really good barometer of where they want to go. Like, these are the top playoff teams in our conference, and we just competed with them. Like, I honestly think like the Pistons having a tough schedule is kind of a blessing in disguise, because it could set the tone for the rest of the season, because you're going up against the best of the best in the Eastern Conference. And I know the schedule doesn't really get too much easier this week outside of Brooklyn and an injured 76ers team, but I still feel really confident in this team. I feel like this is a team that could possibly, you know, I don't want to say turn the page or turn the corner, because I kind of feel like that phrase is used, but even though this team is 0-3, my confidence level with them has kind of stayed the same. I still have them in like that 27, 28 win projection range. I think this is a team that'll be vastly improved from last season. But overall, I thought these games were, you know, entertaining for the most part this week.
Yeah, I think like one last thing on that is I would say my confidence level, I'm someone who predicted them more within like the mid, like the early to mid 30s range. I think my confidence level would be about the same. And I did expect them to kind of start out a little rough, because they have a really rough start to their schedule, and it's not going to get any easier anytime soon. And like, that's why when we were discussing like, you know, schedule release and everything like that, it's like, sure, this part of schedule is obviously more difficult, but at the same time, there is no easy games for the Detroit Pistons, right? Like when you win 14 games, you have no there's no one on the schedule go, oh yeah, it's an easy win for us, right? Because nothing was an easy win last year.